The morning sun cast long shadows across the immense metal beasts that stood in silent formation at the National Armor and Cavalry Museum. Each tank a testament to decades of warfare evolution, each bearing the scars and stories of battles long past. At Fort Benning, Georgia, these monuments to military engineering rested in dignified retirement, their war days behind them, yet their presence still commanded respect. Among them moved Robert Iron Bob Patterson, his weathered hand gliding reverently along the sloped armor of a restored German Panther tank. At 62, Patterson's military bearing remained unmistakable despite the civilian clothes. His back straight as a ramrod, his eyes clear and assessing beneath a shock of silver hair. The desert tan of countless deployments had faded to a permanent weathering on his face, each line telling of decisions made under fire, of commands given that determined who lived and who died. "Notice the slope of the frontal armor," Patterson said, his voice carrying the natural authority of a man accustomed to being heard over the roar of engines and gunfire. 45 degrees effectively increases the armor thickness by nearly 30% without adding additional weight. The Soviets figured this out first with their T-34. The Germans were forced to play catch-up. The group of 20 West Point cadets gathered around him nodded, several jotting notes. These future officers were still untested, their uniforms crisp and academic, their knowledge theoretical. Patterson studied their faces, wondering which among them might someday command armor in actual combat, which might feel the terrible responsibility of sending young Americans into battle inside these mechanical beasts. The Panther was Germany's answer to the T-34. Initially designed as a 30-ton medium tank, Hitler kept demanding more armor, bigger gun. By the time it entered service, it had ballooned to 45 tons, almost as heavy as the Tiger beside it. Patterson gestured to the massive Tiger I positioned nearby, its boxy frame and enormous 88mm gun representing the apex of German engineering prowess, and simultaneously, its strategic failure. And that, gentlemen and ladies, is our first lesson in military procurement. Sometimes what looks best on paper, what tests best on the proving grounds, what impresses the politicians and generals at demonstrations, isn't what actually wins wars. A young cadet raised his hand, his expression earnest. "But sir, wasn't the Tiger superior to anything the Allies had? My grandfather fought in Europe and said American tankers were terrified of encountering Tigers." Patterson nodded, acknowledging the question with a slight smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Your grandfather was right. One-on-one, a Tiger could destroy any Allied tank from distances our Shermans couldn't even effectively return fire. But war isn't fought one-on-one. The Germans could produce one Tiger for the power and man-hours of 5 Shermans. And while they were building a few hundred Tigers, we were building thousands of Shermans." Patterson moved between the 2 German tanks, positioning himself where the entire group could see him. Behind him, the morning light caught the distinctive angles of both machines, casting them in dramatic relief. Tomorrow, the Department of Defense will announce its final decision on the $13 billion Infantry Combat Capability Program. The ICCP will determine the next generation of American armor, and they're facing the exact same question the Germans faced 80 years ago: quality versus quantity, power versus practicality. A few exceptional machines or many very good ones. The cadets exchanged glances. The ICCP had been front-page news for weeks, with leaked reports and speculation dominating military journals and defense industry publications. I've given you the historical context. Now I want you to consider the present-day implications. The stakes aren't just billions of tax dollars. The stakes are American lives, the lives of soldiers like yourselves who will crew whatever vehicle this program ultimately produces. As the cadets began discussing among themselves, Patterson noticed a woman in business-casual attire making her way toward the group. Her press credentials hung around her neck, her digital recorder already in hand. Sarah Mitchell had the focused intensity of a seasoned journalist, her eyes missing nothing as she scanned the assembled cadets and the 2 German tanks that served as their classroom. "Captain Patterson," she called, using his former rank rather than his retired status. "Sarah Mitchell from Defense Analytics. I was hoping to get your thoughts on tomorrow's announcement." Patterson nodded to the cadets, dismissing them to examine the vehicles more closely while he stepped aside to speak with the reporter. He'd known Sarah for years, respected her work. Unlike many defense reporters who simply regurgitated Pentagon press releases, Sarah dug deeper, asked tougher questions. "The usual suspects are saying it's going to be behemoth," she said without preamble. Atlas Defense's stock jumped 12 points yesterday on the rumors. Patterson's expression remained neutral, though a muscle in his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The Pentagon has kept the final decision close to the vest. Anyone claiming to know is speculating. Sarah studied him, her reporter's instinct sensing the careful neutrality in his response. You were on the advisory committee until 2 weeks ago. Your abrupt resignation raised quite a few eyebrows. I submitted my resignation for personal reasons. His tone made it clear he wouldn't elaborate further. Strange timing, though. Resigning just before the final decision on a program you've been consulting on for 3 years. She paused, letting the implication hang in the air before changing tack. The debate seems to mirror what you were just teaching these cadets. Behemoth versus Raptor. Heavy versus medium. Quality versus quantity. Before Patterson could respond, a young man approached them. Tall and fit with Patterson's same piercing blue eyes and square jaw, though his features hadn't yet been hardened by the desert sun and the weight of command. Grandpa, the museum director wanted to know if you'd be willing to say a few words at the reception tonight. The young man noticed Sarah and extended his hand. Jason Patterson, second lieutenant, recently commissioned. Sarah shook his hand, her eyes moving between grandfather and grandson, noting the family resemblance. Sarah Mitchell, Defense Analytics. Your grandfather and I go way back. Ms. Mitchell covered Desert Storm, Patterson explained to his grandson. She was embedded with the 2nd Armored Division, saw some of the heaviest tank battles since World War II. That's where I first saw your grandfather in action, Sarah added. Captain Patterson leading an Abrams company against Republican Guard T-72s, quite a sight. Jason beamed with pride. I grew up hearing those stories. It's why I requested armor as my branch assignment. Something flickered across Patterson's face then. Pride, certainly, but tinged with something darker. Concern, perhaps, or fear. It passed quickly, replaced by the composed expression of a man accustomed to masking his emotions. Tell the director I'd be happy to speak tonight, he told his grandson, and make sure you're back here by 1500. General Williams is bringing in an operational Abrams for demonstration. As Jason departed with a crisp, yes, sir, that spoke to years of ingrained respect, Sarah turned her attention back to Patterson. He reminds me of you, same intensity, same commitment. He's a good kid, smart, dedicated. Patterson watched his grandson walking away, his expression softening momentarily before the professional mask returned. Just graduated top of his class at West Point. Following in your footsteps. Sarah studied Patterson carefully. That must make you proud. Pride is complicated when it comes to sending family into harm's way. Patterson's gaze remained fixed on his grandson's retreating figure. It's one thing to risk your own life, another entirely to watch your flesh and blood follow the same dangerous path. Sarah sensed an opening, a rare moment of vulnerability from a man renowned for his stoicism. Is that why you resigned from the ICCP committee? Concerns about the safety of the next generation of tankers? Patterson turned to her, his eyes suddenly hard as flint. This conversation is off the record, Sarah. I mean it. She switched off her recorder without hesitation. Whatever Patterson was about to say, she knew it was significant. The legendary tank commander didn't show concern lightly. You know me, Bob. I protect my sources. Patterson glanced around, ensuring the cadets were out of earshot, engrossed in their examination of the historic vehicles. When he spoke again, his voice was low but intense. The ICCP decision has been compromised. Political pressure, defense industry influence, career advancement opportunities. Everything except what should matter most. The lives of the young men and women who will fight in these vehicles. Sarah felt a familiar surge of adrenaline, the journalist's equivalent of a soldier's battle readiness. That's a serious allegation. It's not an allegation, it's a fact. Patterson's expression was grim. I've spent my entire adult life in or around tanks. I've fought in them, bled in them, watched friends die in them. I know what works in actual combat, not just in carefully controlled tests designed to produce predetermined outcomes. And the Behemoth doesn't work? Sarah pressed. The Behemoth is an impressive machine, on paper. In reality, it's over-designed, overweight, and over-budget. It excels in the wrong metrics while failing in the ones that actually keep soldiers alive on the modern battlefield. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. But it has powerful backers who stand to make billions if it's selected. Sarah's mind raced through the implications. A procurement scandal of this magnitude would shake the Pentagon to its foundations, potentially reaching into congressional committees and defense contractor boardrooms. I need more than vague allegations, Bob. I need specifics, documents, witnesses. Patterson's expression remained resolute. Come to the reception tonight. 1900 hours. We'll talk more then. As Sarah departed, her mind already composing potential leadees for what might become the biggest story of her career, Patterson turned back to the German tanks. The Panther and Tiger stood as silent reminders of choices made 8 decades ago, choices that had sealed the fate of an empire and cost countless lives. Patterson placed his hand on the cold steel of the Panther, feeling the history beneath his fingers. In his mind, he saw not museum pieces but flaming hulks on distant battlefields. He heard the screams of young men burning inside metal coffins. He smelled the acrid stench of cordite and spilled fuel and cooked flesh. The stakes are always the same, he murmured to himself. Always the same. The museum's lighting cast dramatic shadows across the interior of the Tiger tank as Patterson guided a smaller group through its restored fighting compartment. Jason stood nearby, observing his grandfather with evident admiration as the older man brought history to life. Notice how cramped it is, even for a 4-man crew, Patterson said, gesturing to the confined space. German engineering focused on the gun and armor, sometimes at the expense of the human element. American tanks prioritize crew comfort and ergonomics, understanding that a less fatigued crew makes better decisions under pressure. A female cadet peered through the gunner's sight. The visibility is terrible, she observed. Exactly. The Tiger was deadly in open terrain at long ranges where its gun had the advantage. But in close quarters, in forests or urban environments, its limited visibility and poor maneuverability became fatal weaknesses. Jason spoke up, connecting the historical lesson to present-day concerns. The Behemoth prototype has similar issues, doesn't it? Great firepower and protection, but limited visibility and mobility in urban terrain. Patterson gave his grandson an appraising look. You've been doing your homework. I've read all the publicly available material on both prototypes. Patterson nodded, a hint of approval in his expression. The parallels are concerning. The Behemoth prioritizes protection and firepower for conventional force-on-force scenarios. The Raptor emphasizes mobility, deployability, and adaptability for the varied mission profiles of modern conflicts. The cadets continued examining the Tiger's interior while Patterson stepped outside the tank with Jason, speaking in lower tones. How much do you know about my work on the ICCP committee? Patterson asked his grandson. Jason straightened, recognizing the serious shift in conversation. Only what's been in the press, sir, that you were a technical advisor because of your combat experience with Abrams. Patterson nodded, studying his grandson's face. The boy had his mother's earnestness, an openness that worried Patterson. In the political minefield that surrounded major defense acquisitions, such transparency could be dangerous. I want you to be careful about expressing opinions on the ICCP, especially around senior officers. There are powerful interests invested in the outcome of tomorrow's announcement. Jason frowned, confusion evident in his expression. I don't understand. It's just a procurement decision. It's a $13 billion procurement decision, with follow-on contracts potentially worth 5 times that amount. Patterson's voice carried the weight of experience. There's no such thing as just when that kind of money is involved. Before Jason could press further, they were interrupted by the arrival of a group of senior officers. Leading them was a tall, imposing figure with 3 stars on his collar. Lieutenant General William Blackwood moved with the confident authority of a man accustomed to command, his gaze sweeping the museum before settling on Patterson. Bob, he called, his voice carrying the forced joviality of a public appearance. Still filling young minds with your armor obsession, I see. Patterson straightened reflexively, years of military conditioning asserting themselves despite his civilian status. General Blackwood, I didn't expect you until the reception tonight. Change of plans. The secretary wanted me here for some press availability before tomorrow's announcement. Blackwood's gaze shifted to Jason, taking in the young officer's uniform and new lieutenant bars. And this must be your grandson, the new tanker in the family. Jason saluted crisply. Second Lieutenant Jason Patterson, sir. It's an honor to meet you. Blackwood returned the salute with practiced precision. At ease, Lieutenant. Your grandfather and I go way back, all the way to the academy, class of '85. Patterson watched the exchange with carefully masked concern. Blackwood had been his roommate at West Point, his friend through deployments and career advancements, until recently. General Blackwood is the program executive for the ICCP, Patterson explained to Jason, his tone neutral. The culmination of my career, Blackwood added with a satisfied smile. Tomorrow's announcement represents the future of American armored warfare for the next 30 years. An awkward silence fell between the men, heavy with unspoken tensions. Patterson broke it first, gesturing to the Tiger tank beside them. We were just discussing historical parallels. The Tiger versus Panther debate in Nazi Germany and its relevance to modern procurement decisions. Blackwood's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Always the historian, Bob. Though I seem to recall the Germans lost that war, so perhaps their procurement strategies aren't the best models to emulate. On the contrary, Patterson countered evenly, their mistakes offer the most valuable lessons, especially when we seem determined to repeat them. The temperature of the conversation dropped several degrees. Jason glanced between the two older men, sensing the undercurrent of conflict beneath the superficially cordial exchange. Blackwood's smile remained fixed, though it no longer reached his eyes. I should continue my tour. The press is waiting. Good seeing you, Bob, Lieutenant. With a nod to both men, he rejoined his entourage and moved deeper into the museum. Jason waited until the general was out of earshot before turning to his grandfather. What was that about? I thought you and General Blackwood were friends. Patterson's gaze remained on Blackwood's retreating back. We were, for 40 years. What happened? Priorities changed. Or perhaps they were revealed. Patterson shook his head slightly. Come on, I want to show you the Panther before we break for lunch. As they walked toward the German medium tank, Jason persisted, sensing the importance of understanding the evident rift between his grandfather and General Blackwood. Does this have something to do with your resignation from the committee? Patterson stopped, studying his grandson with a calculating gaze. The boy was perceptive, perhaps too perceptive for his own good. Making a decision, Patterson led Jason to a quiet corner of the museum where they could speak privately. What I'm about to tell you cannot go beyond us. Do you understand? Not your classmates, not your instructors, no one. Jason nodded solemnly. I understand, sir. Patterson took a deep breath, organizing his thoughts. 3 weeks ago, I was shown internal test data that contradicted the official ICCP evaluation reports. Data that clearly favored the Raptor design over the Behemoth in most realistic combat scenarios. Jason's eyes widened. Falsified test results? Not falsified, selectively interpreted. Certain scenarios were weighted more heavily than others to favor Behemoth's strengths while minimizing its weaknesses. That's corruption, isn't it? Patterson's expression was grave. It's politics and money. Atlas Defense has spent millions lobbying for the Behemoth contract. They've hired former generals, former defense secretaries, former congressional committee chairs as consultants. They've spread subcontracts across 37 states to ensure broad political support. But if the Raptor is truly the better vehicle for our soldiers, then it should be selected, yes. Patterson's voice carried the weight of conviction. That's why I resigned. I refused to lend my name and reputation to a process I believe has been compromised. Jason absorbed this information, his youthful idealism visibly shaken. Have you taken this to anyone? The Inspector General, Congress? Without hard evidence, it would be my word against the entire acquisition system. A system that's produced reams of documentation supporting their preferred outcome. The reporter, Ms. Mitchell, that's why she's here, isn't it? You're going to give her the story. Patterson nodded slightly. Sarah has sources I don't. Resources to investigate connections I can only suspect. If anyone can find proof of improper influence, it's her. But going public like this, it could have consequences for your reputation, for your legacy. A grim smile crossed Patterson's weathered features. My legacy isn't in question, Jason. It's yours I'm worried about. Yours and every young tanker who will fight in whatever vehicle wins tomorrow's announcement. The weight of his grandfather's words settled on Jason's shoulders, the full significance of the situation becoming clear. This wasn't merely about procurement policy or defense contracts. This was about the lives of soldiers, about the ethical responsibility of leadership, about the moral courage to stand against a corrupt system even at personal cost. I want to help, Jason said finally, his voice firm with newfound resolve. Tell me what I can do. Before Patterson could respond, a commotion near the museum entrance drew their attention. A group of reporters and photographers had surrounded General Blackwood, who was standing beside a display featuring photographs and artifacts from Desert Storm. The media presence had grown considerably since Sarah's earlier appearance. Looks like the press conference is starting, Patterson observed. Let's observe from a distance. I want you to pay attention to the narrative Blackwood presents. They position themselves at the edge of the gathering crowd, close enough to hear, but far enough to avoid direct involvement. Blackwood stood confident and commanding before the assembled press, with museum staff and senior officers arrayed behind him like a military tableau. Tomorrow marks a historic milestone in American military capability, Blackwood was saying, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of a man accustomed to public speaking. The Infantry Combat Capability Program represents the largest investment in ground combat systems since the Abrams was introduced over 4 decades ago. The photographer's cameras clicked rapidly, capturing the general's confident posture against the backdrop of American military history. While I cannot pre-announce the department's decision, I can say with absolute confidence that America's soldiers will soon have the most advanced, most capable, most survivable combat vehicle ever fielded by any nation. A reporter called out from the crowd, "General, sources indicate the behemoth platform has experienced significant cost overruns and technical challenges. Can you comment on how these factors have influenced the final selection?" Blackwood's smile never faltered. All major defense acquisitions face challenges during development. What matters is the end result, a combat system that ensures American dominance on the battlefield for decades to come. Another voice from the press corps, the Raptor prototype reportedly outperformed Behemoth in urban combat and rapid deployment scenarios. Given the nature of modern conflicts, why isn't the department prioritizing these capabilities? A flash of irritation crossed Blackwood's features before his media-trained composure reasserted itself. The department considers all relevant combat scenarios in its evaluation process. Our selection criteria are comprehensive and forward-looking, based on the full spectrum of potential conflict environments our forces may encounter. Patterson leaned closer to Jason, speaking softly. Notice the non-answers, the emphasis on process rather than results, the appeals to authority rather than evidence. Jason nodded, his expression thoughtful as he studied the performance unfolding before them. "General!" called a familiar voice, and Patterson straightened as he recognized Sarah Mitchell pushing to the front of the press group. "You've previously stated that crew survivability is the top priority in the ICCP selection process. Yet internal Defense Department studies indicate the Raptor's distributed armor system and smaller profile actually result in higher crew survivability rates in most combat scenarios. How do you reconcile these findings with the apparent preference for Behemoth?" A momentary silence fell over the gathering. Blackwood's expression hardened almost imperceptibly as he recognized Sarah. His response when it came was measured but carried an undertone of steel. "Ms. Mitchell, I'm not sure what internal studies you're referring to, but I can assure you that all performance metrics, including crew survivability, are thoroughly evaluated by qualified experts. I would caution against relying on leaked documents that may present incomplete or contextless data." Sarah pressed further. "Multiple sources within the test program have confirmed that Behemoth suffered catastrophic mobility failures during desert testing, requiring emergency evacuation of crew members in 3 separate incidents. Yet these failures were classified as non-critical in the final evaluation report. Who made that determination, and based on what criteria?" The atmosphere in the room shifted palpably. Other reporters, sensing blood in the water, began murmuring among themselves. Blackwood's staff exchanged concerned glances. "I think we've had enough questions for now," an aide announced, stepping forward to end the press conference. "General Blackwood has other commitments this afternoon. Thank you all for coming." As the gathering dispersed, Blackwood's gaze swept the crowd and locked briefly with Patterson's. No words were exchanged, but the message was clear. Battle lines had been drawn. "She's good," Jason murmured, watching Sarah quickly typing notes into her phone as she exited. "She's one of the best," Patterson agreed. "And she just put Blackwood on notice that tomorrow's announcement won't go unchallenged." They made their way outside where the Georgia sun beat down on the museum grounds with mid-afternoon intensity. In the distance, the distinctive silhouette of an M1 Abrams tank could be seen approaching the museum's demonstration area, its turbine engine producing a characteristic high-pitched whine. "There's our ride for the afternoon demonstration." Patterson nodded toward the approaching tank. "Let's get something to eat before the show starts." As they walked toward the museum cafe, Jason remained thoughtful, processing the implications of what he'd witnessed. "Grandpa, you mentioned showing me internal test data that contradicted the official reports. How did you get access to that information?" Patterson glanced around before answering, ensuring they weren't overheard. "I didn't seek it out. It was brought to me by someone within the program who was equally concerned about the direction things were heading." "A whistleblower?" Someone with a conscience. Someone who remembered that their ultimate responsibility isn't to a procurement program or a defense contractor, but to the soldiers who will fight and possibly die in these vehicles. Jason considered this. Do you think one reporter can make a difference against the entire defense acquisition system? Patterson's expression was grim but determined. I don't know, but I do know that remaining silent wasn't an option I could live with. They entered the cafe, joining the line of museum visitors and military personnel seeking refreshment. As they waited, Patterson continued in low tones. Tonight at the reception, Sarah will be meeting someone who has documentation supporting what I've told her. After that, it becomes her story to pursue. My role will be limited to providing context and analysis. And if it doesn't work, if the announcement proceeds as planned tomorrow, Patterson's weathered face showed the resolve that had carried him through 3 combat deployments and countless life or death decisions. Then we live with the consequences and do what soldiers have always done. Make the best of the equipment we're given, adapt and overcome. Their conversation paused as they reached the counter and placed their orders. Finding a quiet table in the corner, they continued their discussion over sandwiches and coffee. There's something I've never told you about Desert Storm, Patterson said, after ensuring they wouldn't be overheard. Something that shaped my entire perspective on military procurement and combat vehicle design. Jason leaned forward, instantly attentive. His grandfather rarely spoke in detail about his combat experiences, especially from the First Gulf War. It was February 26, 1991. My company was part of the 2nd Armored Division, spearheading the assault into Iraq. We encountered elements of the Republican Guard's Tawakalna Division near a place that would later be known as 73 Easting. Patterson's eyes took on a distant quality as he revisited memories nearly 35 years old, yet still vivid in his mind's eye. The Iraqi forces were equipped with Soviet-made T-72 tanks. On paper, they were formidable opponents to our Abrams. In reality, the disparity in technology, training, and tactical employment created one of the most lopsided tank battles in modern history. He paused, taking a sip of his coffee. We destroyed over 80 Iraqi armored vehicles without losing a single Abrams, a complete victory by any military standard. Jason nodded, familiar with the broad outlines of the battle that had become legendary in armor circles, often cited as evidence of American technological superiority. What isn't in the official records, Patterson continued, his voice dropping even lower, is what happened to Echo Company's 3rd Platoon. My closest friend, Kevin Matthews, was their platoon leader. Patterson's expression darkened with the weight of memory. Their lead tank took a hit from an Iraqi T-72. The round didn't penetrate the armor, but it severed the fuel line to the turbine engine. The resulting fire was catastrophic. Jason remained silent, recognizing the difficulty his grandfather had in relating this story. 4 men, Kevin Matthews, Jackson Reeves, Thomas Connolly, and David Washington, all dead because of a design flaw that had been identified during testing but deemed acceptable because it affected only a small percentage of hits in a specific location. Patterson's hand tightened around his coffee cup. After the war, the Abrams underwent a modification program to address that vulnerability. New fuel line routing, improved fire suppression systems, better compartmentalization. The deaths of those 4 men led to improvements that likely saved dozens of lives in subsequent conflicts. He looked directly at his grandson, his gaze intense. That's the reality of armor warfare, Jason. When we make mistakes in design, in procurement, in tactical employment, we don't just lose battles, we lose sons, fathers, husbands, friends. We lose young men like Kevin Matthews, who had their whole lives ahead of them. Jason absorbed his grandfather's words, understanding now the personal stake driving Patterson's concern over the ICCP decision. The behemoth has vulnerabilities, doesn't it? Ones that aren't being adequately addressed. Patterson nodded grimly. Multiple vulnerabilities that the Raptor design specifically overcomes. But acknowledging those weaknesses would require admitting that the entire conceptual approach behind Behemoth is flawed. Too many careers and too much money are invested in that approach for such an admission to be politically acceptable. Their conversation was interrupted by an announcement over the museum's PA system that the Abrams demonstration would begin in 15 minutes. We should head over, Patterson said, gathering their trash. But remember what I've told you. This isn't about tanks, Jason. It's not about technology or budgets or politics. It's about people. It's always about people. As they walked toward the demonstration area, The massive form of the Abrams tank dominated the landscape. Its 120mm main gun elevated slightly as if in salute to the visitors gathering to witness its capabilities. "It's a beautiful machine," Jason said, admiring the tank that had defined American armored warfare for decades. "Yes, it is," Patterson agreed. "And it's a testament to what American engineering can accomplish when the focus stays on the mission and the men, not on profit margins and political considerations." They joined the growing crowd around the demonstration area, where museum staff were setting up a temporary grandstand. Sarah Mitchell was already there, her press credentials allowing her access to a preferred viewing area. She caught Patterson's eye and gave a subtle nod, which he returned with equal discretion. As they found seats, Jason leaned toward his grandfather. "What exactly are you hoping will happen?" "Best case scenario." Patterson considered the question carefully. "Best case? The department delays tomorrow's announcement pending a full review of the test data and evaluation criteria. Worst case? The behemoth gets selected, and we spend the next decade trying to fix its inherent flaws while soldiers pay the price in blood." The demonstration began with the Abrams performing a series of maneuvers, showcasing its remarkable agility despite its 60-ton weight. The crowd applauded appreciatively as the tank executed tight turns and accelerated with surprising speed across the demonstration ground. "Notice the mobility," and Patterson commented to Jason. "The turbine engine provides enormous torque at low speeds. That translates directly to tactical advantage in combat situations." The tank came to a halt facing the grandstand, its massive gun traversing smoothly to demonstrate the turret's hydraulic systems. "Now watch the gun stabilization," Patterson continued, as the tank began moving again while keeping its main gun trained on a target. The gunner can maintain target lock even while moving at 30 miles per hour across rough terrain. That's the difference between hitting an enemy tank or missing. Jason observed intently, seeing beyond the impressive display to the combat implications of each demonstrated capability. "The behemoth sacrifices some of that mobility for additional armor protection," Patterson explained quietly. "The Raptor maintains similar mobility to the Abrams while incorporating next-generation defensive systems that don't add as much weight." The demonstration continued with a simulated firing sequence. The tank's gun elevated and depressed to show its range of motion. The crowd's enthusiasm was evident, with many taking photos and videos of the iconic American war machine in action. As the presentation concluded and the audience began to disperse, Sarah Mitchell approached Patterson and Jason. "Impressive machine," she commented, nodding toward the Abrams as it powered down, its turbine engine winding down with a distinctive descending whine. "Hard to believe it's been in service for over 40 years. With continuous upgrades and modifications," Patterson noted. "That's the key to successful platform longevity. Design something fundamentally sound, then improve it incrementally as technology advances and combat lessons are incorporated." Sarah nodded, then lowered her voice. "I got your message about tonight. 1900 hours at the reception. I'll be there." "Good. And Sarah, be careful who you talk to between now and then. The stakes are higher than either of us initially realized." She raised an eyebrow at this, but didn't press for details. "Always. I've been covering defense procurement long enough to know how the game is played." As Sarah departed, Jason gave his grandfather a questioning look. "You think someone might try to interfere with her reporting?" "I think $13 billion creates powerful incentives," Patterson replied grimly, "and careers have been destroyed over far less." They began walking back toward the museum building, where preparations for the evening reception were already underway. Staff were arranging tables and displays, transforming the main hall into an elegant venue worthy of the high-ranking officers and dignitaries expected to attend. "I need you to do something for me," Patterson said as they reached the entrance. "Something that carries some risk." Jason straightened, his expression serious. "Anything, sir." "Tonight at the reception, I want you to stay close to General Blackwood. Engage him in conversation about your interest in armor, your recent commissioning, your hopes for your military career. Nothing suspicious, nothing about the ICCP decision. Just a new lieutenant showing appropriate respect to a 3-star general." "You want me to spy on him?" Jason asked, his voice dropping to a whisper. Patterson shook his head. "Not spy. Observe, listen. Blackwood tends to let his guard down around junior officers he sees as admiring his accomplishments. He might say something revealing, especially after a few glasses of wine." Jason considered this request, clearly uncomfortable with the deception it entailed. "This feels unethical." More or less ethical than allowing a potentially corrupt procurement decision to proceed unchallenged? Patterson countered. More or less ethical than remaining silent when you know soldiers' lives are at stake? The young officer wrestled with the moral calculus, his sense of duty and integrity clearly in conflict. Finally, he nodded. I'll do it, but only because I trust your judgment that this is necessary. That's all I can ask. Patterson placed a hand on his grandson's shoulder. Now let's go get changed for tonight. It's going to be a long evening. As they walked toward the parking lot where Patterson's car awaited, the retired tank commander cast a final glance back at the museum where the silent forms of the panther and tiger still stood in mute testimony to decisions made long ago. Decisions that had changed the course of history and determined the fates of nations. Tonight, he hoped, would mark the beginning of a different kind of battle. One fought not with guns and armor, but with information and truth. The stakes, however, were just as high. The evening reception at the Armor Museum gleamed with military pageantry and defense industry affluence. Dress uniforms adorned with ribbons and medals mingled with expensive suits, the atmosphere charged with the particular energy that emerges when power, money, and martial tradition converge. Crystal glasses clinked, polite laughter rippled across the marble floor, and beneath it all flowed currents of ambition and influence that would shape the future of American military capability. Robert Patterson stood at the edge of the gathering, a tumbler of scotch in his hand more as a prop than a refreshment. His dress uniform, still immaculately fitted despite years of retirement, bore the combat decorations and unit citations that testified to a career defined by service and sacrifice. He watched the social dynamics of the room with the same tactical awareness that had once helped him command tanks in combat, noting who spoke with whom, which conversations seemed tense, which relaxed. Across the room, he spotted his grandson Jason engaged in conversation with General Blackwood, just as they had planned. The young lieutenant maintained a respectful posture, his expression one of earnest attention, as Blackwood gesticulated emphatically, clearly warming to whatever topic they were discussing. Nearby, several executives from Atlas Defense hovered, waiting for their opportunity to recapture the general's attention. They're like vultures, aren't they? Patterson turned to find Sarah Mitchell beside him, elegant in a conservative black dress that managed to look both professional and appropriate for the evening's formality. More like hyenas, Patterson replied quietly. Scavengers who feed off the carcass of the defense budget. Sarah raised an eyebrow. Feeling poetic tonight, Captain? Realistic. I've watched this same scene play out dozens of times over my career. The uniforms and faces change, the programs have different acronyms, but the essential dynamic remains the same. Sarah sipped her wine, her gaze sweeping the room. Your contact confirmed for tonight? Patterson nodded slightly. Should be here within the hour. Upper-level program manager with direct access to the original test data and the modified evaluation criteria. Brave soul. Patriot. Someone who remembers that the purpose of the entire defense acquisition system is to provide American warfighters with the tools they need to win on the battlefield and come home alive. Their conversation paused as a museum staff member approached the podium at the front of the hall, tapping a microphone to gain the attention of the gathered crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, please. It is my honor to introduce our keynote speaker for this evening, a man whose distinguished career spans from the deserts of Iraq to the corridors of the Pentagon. Please welcome Lieutenant General William Blackwood, Program Executive Officer for the Infantry Combat Capability Program. Polite applause filled the hall as Blackwood made his way to the podium, his confident stride and commanding presence drawing all eyes in the room. Patterson noticed how the Atlas defense executives positioned themselves prominently in Blackwood's sightline, their expressions eager and expectant. Thank you for that kind introduction, Blackwood began, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of a man accustomed to public speaking. And thank you all for joining us on this historic evening, the eve of what I believe will be remembered as a watershed moment in American armored warfare capability. Patterson tensed slightly, sensing the direction of Blackwood's remarks. Beside him, Sarah had produced a small recorder, capturing the general's words for later reference. Tomorrow, the Department of Defense will announce its selection for the Infantry Combat Capability Program, representing years of development, testing, and evaluation by the finest minds in our military and defense industrial base. Blackwood's gaze swept the room, lingering briefly on the Atlas executives before continuing. While I cannot pre-announce that decision here tonight, I can say with absolute confidence that America's soldiers will soon have a combat system that ensures their dominance on the modern battlefield, a system that combines unmatched lethality, unparalleled protection, and the technological sophistication that has been the hallmark of American military superiority for generations. The room responded with appreciative murmurs and nods. Patterson remained stone-faced, recognizing the careful language that praised the program without committing to specific details. As we stand in this magnificent museum, surrounded by the armored vehicles that have carried our nation through conflicts from World War II to the global war on terror, we are reminded that each generation must make its contribution to America's arsenal of democracy. Tomorrow, we make ours. The speech continued with similar themes, emphasizing American technological leadership, the evolutionary nature of combat vehicle development, and the sacred trust between the acquisition community and the soldiers who would ultimately employ the selected system in combat. Throughout, Patterson noted the careful omission of any specific reference to either the Behemoth or Raptor platforms, though the language subtly emphasized attributes that aligned with the heavier Behemoth design. As Blackwood concluded to enthusiastic applause, Patterson exchanged a knowing glance with Sarah. The speech had been masterfully crafted to create an aura of inevitability around tomorrow's announcement without actually revealing its content. Classic pre-announcement positioning, Sarah murmured, setting the narrative frame that the selected system represents the consensus choice of experts rather than a politically influenced decision. Patterson nodded grimly, and ensuring that any subsequent criticism can be portrayed as undermining the troops or questioning America's technical superiority. They watched as Blackwood descended from the podium into a cluster of well-wishers, with the Atlas executives quickly maneuvering to claim his attention. Jason had positioned himself nearby, apparently engaged in conversation with a museum curator, but clearly within earshot of Blackwood's circle. "Your grandson plays his part well," Sarah observed. "Natural intelligence officer material." "Let's hope not," Patterson replied with a hint of a smile. "The family tradition is armor, not spycraft." Their banter was interrupted by the arrival of a middle-aged woman in civilian business attire, her Department of Defense credentials displayed discreetly on her lapel. Her expression was tense, her movements suggesting someone trying very hard to appear casual while acutely aware of being potentially observed. "Ms. Mitchell," she said quietly, extending her hand to Sarah. "Carol Henderson, we spoke earlier." Sarah shook her hand professionally. "Thank you for coming, Ms. Henderson. This is retired Captain Robert Patterson, former ICCP Advisory Committee member." Henderson nodded to Patterson, recognition in her eyes. "Captain, your resignation caused quite a stir within the program office." "I imagine it did." Henderson glanced nervously around the room before returning her attention to them. "Is there somewhere more private we could speak?" Patterson gestured toward a side hallway leading to some of the museum's smaller exhibition rooms. The World War II small arms display should be empty at this hour. The three made their way discreetly through the crowd, Patterson nodding to acquaintances as they passed but avoiding engagement. Once inside the dimly lit exhibition room, surrounded by glass cases containing historic pistols, rifles, and machine guns, Henderson visibly relaxed slightly. "I shouldn't be here," she said without preamble. "If anyone from the program office sees me talking to you—" "We understand the risk you're taking," Sarah assured her, "and will protect you as a source." Henderson reached into her purse and removed a small USB drive, holding it for a moment as if weighing her final decision before handing it to Sarah. "This contains the original test data from both vehicle platforms across all evaluation scenarios. The raw data before the weighted scoring matrices were applied. It also contains emails between senior program officials discussing how to adjust the evaluation criteria to favor Behemoth despite Raptor's superior performance in mobility, deployability, and crew survivability tests." Sarah accepted the drive, immediately securing it in an inner pocket of her purse. "This is exactly what we need, thank you." "There's more," Henderson continued, her voice tight with controlled stress. "The drive also contains documentation of 3 meetings between General Blackwood and Marcus Reynolds, CEO of Atlas Defense, that weren't disclosed in Blackwood's official ethics filings. 2 at Reynolds' private lodge in Montana, 1 aboard his yacht in Miami." Patterson's expression darkened. "During the competitive phase of the program?" Henderson nodded. "All 3 within the last 8 months. No official record of the content of these meetings exists, but they coincide with significant adjustments to the evaluation criteria that benefited Behemoth." "And there's a financial connection?" Sarah pressed. "Nothing I could document directly, But there are rumors that Blackwood has been promised a senior executive position at Atlas after his retirement next year. Compensation package allegedly north of 7 figures. The implications hung heavily in the air between them. If true, this represented not just procedural irregularities, but potential criminal conduct under federal ethics laws. "Why are you doing this?" Patterson asked quietly, studying Henderson's face. "Why take the risk?" She met his gaze steadily. "My brother is a master sergeant with the 1st Armored Division. He's deployed twice to Iraq, once to Afghanistan. Whatever vehicle wins tomorrow's announcement, he and soldiers like him will be the ones riding into combat in it." The simplicity and power of her motivation resonated deeply with Patterson. This wasn't about politics or career advancement or corporate profits. It was about the fundamental obligation to provide American soldiers with the best possible equipment for their dangerous mission. "What happens next?" Henderson asked. Sarah tucked her recorder away, her expression professionally focused. "I review the documents, verify what I can independently, and prepare to publish depending on what the announcement reveals tomorrow. If Behemoth is selected despite all this evidence favoring Raptor, we'll move quickly with the story. And if the unexpected happens, if Raptor wins, then we hold, pending further investigation. But based on everything we're hearing, that outcome seems increasingly unlikely." Henderson nodded, accepting this approach. "I should return to the reception before my absence is noticed. We shouldn't leave together." "Of course," Sarah agreed. "I'll go first, then the captain, then you. Wait at least 5 minutes between exits." As Sarah departed, Henderson turned to Patterson, her expression earnest. "I read your combat reports from Desert Storm, Captain. Your actions at 73 Easting are taught at the Command and General Staff College as a case study in armor tactics." Patterson acknowledged this with a modest nod. "A long time ago. The point is, you've earned the right to be heard on matters of armor employment and design. The fact that they've marginalized your input speaks volumes about the process." "It's not about me, Ms. Henderson. It's about getting this right for the next generation." Her gaze was steady, respectful. "That's why I'm doing this. For the next generation." After Sarah had departed, and before Henderson would follow, Patterson found himself alone in the exhibition room, surrounded by the weapons that had defined combat in an earlier era. Each firearm in its display case represented design decisions, procurement choices, manufacturing priorities that had directly impacted the lives of the young men who carried them into battle. Some of those decisions had been made with clarity of purpose and genuine concern for the soldiers' well-being. Others had been compromised by politics, profit motives, or simply poor judgment. The soldiers paid the price either way. Patterson moved toward the exit, pausing briefly before a display containing a Browning automatic rifle, a weapon that had earned legendary status among American infantry in World War II despite its weight and complexity. A testament to the fact that sometimes the best solution wasn't the perfect one, but the one that worked when needed most. As he rejoined the reception, his gaze sought out his grandson, finding Jason still positioned near General Blackwood's group. The young officer caught his grandfather's eye briefly, giving an almost imperceptible nod that suggested he had indeed heard something of value. Patterson checked his watch. Nearly 2 hours remained in the scheduled event, 2 hours of maintaining appearances while the most significant evidence of procurement impropriety he'd encountered in his entire career now resided on a thumb drive in Sarah Mitchell's possession. Tomorrow would bring either vindication or the beginning of a longer, harder fight. Either way, he was committed to seeing it through. Not for his own sake, but for Jason and all the young soldiers who would someday trust their lives to the vehicle that emerged from this process. The weight of that responsibility had defined Patterson's career. Now, in what should have been his retirement, it defined his purpose once again. The battle had changed form, the weapons were different, but the stakes remained the same. Always the same. The morning of the announcement dawned bright and clear over Fort Benning, the Georgia sun rising into a cloudless sky, as if nature itself approved of the momentous decision to be revealed. Robert Patterson stood at the window of his hotel room, already dressed in a crisp suit, watching the early light cast long shadows across the landscape. In his hand, a cup of black coffee cooled untouched, his mind occupied with the gravity of the day ahead. A soft knock at the door broke his reverie. He opened it to find Jason, already in his dress uniform, his lieutenant's bars catching the light. "You're up early," Patterson observed, stepping aside to let his grandson enter. "Couldn't sleep," Jason admitted. His normally confident expression was troubled. the weight of last night's revelations evident in the tightness around his eyes. I kept thinking about what I overheard at the reception. Patterson closed the door quietly. Tell me. Jason took a deep breath, organizing his thoughts. After you left, General Blackwood had several more drinks. He became less guarded. One of the Atlas executives, Reynolds I think, mentioned something about celebration plans in Aspen next month. Blackwood laughed and said they should wait until after the Congressional Appropriations Committee approved the full production contract before celebrating. Patterson's expression darkened, suggesting he already knows the outcome of those hearings. There's more, Jason continued. When a colonel from Army Futures Command joined the conversation and asked about the Raptor's superior performance in the urban combat scenarios, Blackwood dismissed it completely. Said, and I'm quoting here, the next major war will be fought on the plains of Eastern Europe against near-peer armor, not in some third world urban hellhole. We're building for the real fight, not peacekeeping missions. Patterson shook his head in disbelief, as if the last 50 years of actual combat experience teaches us nothing, as if Iraq and Afghanistan never happened. The colonel tried to push back, mentioning Ukraine and the importance of urban operations there. Blackwood cut him off, told him his next performance review might reflect his failure to embrace the Army's strategic vision. A threat, unmistakably. Jason's jaw tightened with controlled anger. It was disillusioning, Grandpa. This isn't what I expected when I commissioned. Patterson placed a hand on his grandson's shoulder. The Army is made up of people, Jason. Most serve with honor and integrity, but some lose their way, especially when power, money, and ambition enter the equation. It doesn't diminish the institution or its values, just reminds us why those values must be vigilantly protected. The young officer nodded, seeming to draw strength from his grandfather's perspective. What's our plan for today? Sarah is reviewing the documents from Henderson. The announcement is scheduled for 1,000 hours at the Pentagon with satellite feeds to major installations, including here at Benning. We'll attend the viewing at the museum auditorium, gauge the reaction, then meet with Sarah afterward to determine next steps. And if Behemoth wins as expected, then the real fight begins. Patterson's voice carried the calm determination of a man who had faced enemy fire without flinching. We'll have approximately 72 hours before the news cycle moves on to the next story. 3 days to get the evidence into the hands of key congressional committee members, inspectors general, and select media outlets. Jason considered this, the tactical thinking he'd inherited from his grandfather evident in his expression. Simultaneous disclosure on multiple fronts, like a combined arms assault. A small smile touched Patterson's weathered features. Exactly. No single point of failure, no single point of defense. The truth is our main battle tank in this engagement, and we need to ensure it reaches its objective. They were interrupted by Patterson's phone ringing. Sarah Mitchell's name flashed on the screen. Patterson, he answered, putting the call on speaker. Bob, I've been through the documents. Sarah's voice carried a mixture of professional excitement and moral outrage. It's worse than we thought. The original test data is unambiguous. Raptor outperformed Behemoth in 78% of realistic combat scenarios. The only areas where Behemoth showed clear advantage were in direct frontal engagements against near-peer armor in open terrain. Exactly the scenario Blackwood emphasized last night, Jason interjected. Who's that with you? Sarah asked. My grandson, Jason. He overheard some concerning comments from Blackwood at the reception last night. Good. We need all the corroboration we can get. Sarah continued, her voice dropping slightly as if concerned about being overheard despite being on the phone. The emails are equally damning. There's a clear pattern of senior program officials adjusting evaluation criteria after seeing the initial results. Scenario weighting, survivability metrics, deployment timelines, all modified to favor Behemoth's strengths and minimize its weaknesses. Enough to prove intentional manipulation, Patterson asked? Enough to warrant a full inspector general investigation at minimum. Potentially enough for congressional hearings. Sarah paused. There's a personal element too. Several emails reference your growing concerns and the need to manage Patterson's perspectives before you became a problem. Patterson's expression remained impassive, but Jason could see a flicker of hurt in his eyes. These were colleagues, fellow officers he'd served alongside for decades. One email from Blackwood specifically states that Patterson's combat experience makes him credible with Congress and the media, so his objections represent a significant program risk. They were actively strategizing how to neutralize your influence months before you resigned. That explains the sudden reduction in my access to test results and evaluation criteria modifications, Patterson said quietly. I was being isolated. Exactly, and there's more about the Atlas connection. 3 other program officials besides Blackwood have undisclosed relationships with Atlas executives. Hunting trips, private flights, kids getting internships at Atlas subsidiaries. Nothing overtly illegal, perhaps, but certainly creating the appearance of conflict of interest. Patterson absorbed this information, his tactician's mind already calculating implications and options. What's your plan with this material? I've got a draft article ready to publish as soon as the announcement is made. Headline, questions surround billion-dollar tank decision. Exclusive documents reveal testing irregularities and undisclosed conflicts. My editor is on standby, and we've had legal review it for potential liability issues. Good. We need to be absolutely bulletproof on this. Atlas has an army of lawyers, and the department has even more. Agreed. I've scrubbed any information that might identify Henderson as the source. As far as my article is concerned, these documents came from multiple sources familiar with the program. Patterson nodded approvingly. We'll see you at the museum after the announcement. Look for us near the Sherman exhibit. After ending the call, Patterson turned to find Jason watching him with a troubled expression. What is it? He asked. I just realized the scale of what we're doing, Jason said quietly. Potentially derailing a $13 billion defense program, challenging the integrity of senior leaders, including a 3-star general. There will be consequences. Yes, there will be. For all of us, including me. There was no self-pity in the young officer's voice, only a clear-eyed assessment of reality. A newly commissioned lieutenant associated with this kind of controversy might find his career options limited. Patterson studied his grandson, pride mixing with concern in his gaze. I wouldn't have involved you if I'd fully understood how deep this goes. You can step back, Jason. No one would blame you. In fact, I'd prefer you did. Jason straightened, his decision already made. With respect, sir, that's not going to happen. If officers aren't willing to stand up for the truth, even when it's personally costly, then what are we really defending? The simple integrity of his grandson's position moved Patterson deeply, though he kept his emotion carefully controlled. Your father would be proud of you. I know I am. Jason smiled slightly. He'd probably tell me I'm being naive and idealistic. Maybe, but he'd respect the choice. Patterson checked his watch. We should get moving. The announcement viewing starts in 90 minutes. As they gathered their belongings and prepared to depart for the museum, Patterson found himself reflecting on the parallels between their current situation and the historical decisions made in Nazi Germany 8 decades earlier. In both cases, powerful interests pushed for impressive but impractical weapon systems against the advice of those with actual combat experience. The difference was that in America, there still existed the possibility of accountability, of correction through transparency and public discourse. That difference was what they were fighting to preserve. The museum auditorium buzzed with anticipation as officers, defense contractors, and military enthusiasts gathered to watch the live Pentagon briefing. Large screens displayed the Department of Defense seal as attendees found their seats, their conversations a mix of speculation and industry gossip. Patterson and Jason positioned themselves near the back, allowing for easy observation of the room's reactions. Sarah Mitchell entered a few minutes before the scheduled start, catching Patterson's eye briefly before taking a seat in the press section. She appeared composed but alert, her recorder and notebook ready, her phone positioned for immediate communication with her editor. The screens flickered as the Pentagon briefing room came into view. The Deputy Secretary of Defense approached the podium, flanked by service chiefs and acquisition executives. The room quieted instantly, all attention focused on the impending announcement. Good morning, the Deputy Secretary began. Today marks a significant milestone in the modernization of our nation's ground combat capabilities. After exhaustive testing, evaluation, and analysis, I am pleased to announce that the Department of Defense has selected Atlas Defense Corporation's Behemoth platform as the winner of the Infantry Combat Capability Program competition. A mixture of reactions rippled through the museum audience. Atlas representatives exchanged handshakes and barely suppressed smiles. Officers with program connections nodded approvingly. Others, particularly those from operational units with recent combat deployments, appeared more reserved in their response. Patterson's expression remained impassive as the deputy secretary continued outlining the behemoth's purported advantages, though Jason noticed his grandfather's knuckles whitening as he gripped the armrest of his chair. Initial production contracts, valued at $13.4 billion, have been awarded, with potential follow-on contracts for variants and support systems that could exceed $40 billion over the program's lifetime. Sarah was already typing rapidly on her phone, presumably communicating with her editor to greenlight publication of her investigative piece. Patterson watched as she stood and quietly exited the auditorium, their agreed signal that she was proceeding with the story. The briefing continued with technical details and deployment timelines, but Patterson had heard enough. He nodded to Jason and they discreetly made their way out of the auditorium toward their prearranged meeting point near the Sherman tank exhibit. They found Sarah already there, engaged in an intense phone conversation. As they approached, she concluded her call. "It's live," she informed them without preamble. "The article just published on Defense Analytics website. My editor is already fielding calls from other media outlets and congressional staff offices." Patterson nodded, his expression grim but determined. "How long until the department is forced to respond?" "Hours at most. The allegations are too specific to ignore. The documents too detailed to dismiss as simple misunderstanding." Sarah checked her phone as a new message appeared. "CNN is picking up the story. They want me on air at 1400 hours." "Good. The wider the coverage, the harder it becomes to suppress." Patterson turned to Jason. "You should distance yourself from this now. Return to your unit. Maintain plausible deniability about your involvement." Jason shook his head firmly. "I'm staying. Whatever happens, I need to see it through." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a museum staff member, his expression concerned. "Captain Patterson, there are some men asking for you at the main entrance. They say they are from the Department of Defense Inspector General's office." Patterson exchanged glances with Sarah and Jason. That was fast. Too fast for a legitimate response to the article. A preemptive move, Sarah surmised. They must have known the story was coming. Or they were monitoring Henderson and identified her as the leak. Patterson's tactical mind quickly assessed their position. "Jason, go with Sarah. Take her back exit through the restoration workshop. I'll meet these gentlemen and buy you some time." "Grandpa, I don't think—" "That's an order, Lieutenant." Patterson's voice carried the unmistakable authority of command. "Get clear of the building, then call Colonel Harper at Fort Irwin. Tell him Thunderbolt is in effect. He'll understand." Recognizing the futility of arguing, Jason nodded reluctantly. "Yes, sir, but we're not leaving Georgia without you." "I'll be fine. This is America, not some banana republic. They can question me, but they can't disappear me." Patterson straightened his jacket. "Now go." As Jason and Sarah departed through a side exit, Patterson composed himself and walked deliberately toward the main entrance. 3 men in suits waited there, their stances and haircuts marking them as clearly as if they still wore their military uniforms. "Captain Patterson?" the lead man asked, displaying credentials. "I'm Special Agent Wilson, DOD, Inspector General's office. We need to ask you some questions regarding classified information that may have been improperly disclosed." Patterson maintained a calm, professional demeanor. "Of course, I'm happy to cooperate, though I'm not currently in possession of any classified information related to my prior advisory role with ICCP. Nevertheless, we'll need you to come with us to a more appropriate location for this discussion." Patterson noted the carefully worded non-request. Not quite an arrest, but certainly not optional. "Am I under investigation? Should I have legal representation present?" Wilson's expression remained neutral. "This is simply a preliminary inquiry, Captain, to help us determine if a full investigation is warranted. You're not currently a subject of investigation." "I see. And where exactly will this preliminary inquiry take place?" "We have arranged appropriate facilities at the base." Patterson considered his options. Refusing would escalate the situation unnecessarily and potentially lead to a formal detention. Agreeing would buy time for Sarah's story to gain traction and for Jason to contact Colonel Harper, who commanded the Army's premier training center and had been Patterson's executive officer during Desert Storm. "Very well," he said finally, "though I'd like to inform my family of where I'm going and when I might return." "You can call them once we arrive at the facility," Wilson replied, gesturing toward the exit where a black SUV waited. Patterson allowed himself to be escorted from the museum, maintaining a dignified bearing that belied the gravity of the situation. As they drove away from the museum complex, he caught a glimpse of Sarah's car, leaving the parking area from another exit, Jason in the passenger seat. At least that part of the plan had succeeded. The appropriate facilities turned out to be a secure conference room in Fort Benning's Military Intelligence Battalion headquarters. Patterson was escorted inside and offered a seat at a table already prepared with a digital recorder, notepads, and bottled water. The setting was deliberately non-threatening while still conveying official authority. "Before we begin," Patterson said as Wilson and his two colleagues arranged themselves across the table, "I'd like to clarify something. My understanding is that the Inspector General's office typically investigates allegations of waste, fraud, or abuse within department programs. Yet you've mentioned classified information disclosure, which would normally fall under counterintelligence or security violation investigations." Wilson exchanged glances with his colleagues. "Captain Patterson, given your distinguished service record, I'll be direct. We're here because an article was published this morning containing information from internal ICCP documents that, while not classified in the strict sense, were certainly not authorized for public release." "I see. And you believe I provided these documents to the media?" "We're investigating all possibilities. Your recent resignation from the advisory committee, followed by this disclosure, creates a certain temporal connection that requires examination." Patterson maintained a neutral expression. "I resigned because I disagreed with the direction the program was taking. I felt the evaluation process had become compromised by factors outside the stated requirements and testing criteria." "So you've stated, however, disagreeing with the program's direction doesn't justify unauthorized disclosure of internal deliberations." "No, it doesn't. Though exposing potential misconduct, conflicts of interest, or the manipulation of test results to favor a predetermined outcome would certainly fall within legitimate whistleblower protections, wouldn't you agree?" Wilson's expression tightened slightly. "That determination would depend on numerous factors, including the nature of the information, the channels through which concerns were raised, and the methods of disclosure." "Of course." Patterson leaned forward slightly. "Let me be clear about something. I have tremendous respect for the Inspector General's mission and for the integrity of DoD investigative processes. But I'm concerned that in this specific instance, your office may be being used as a tool to intimidate potential whistleblowers rather than to investigate the substantive allegations now in the public domain." The statement landed like a grenade in the middle of the table. The two junior agents looked uncomfortable, while Wilson maintained his professional composure with visible effort. "That's a serious accusation, Captain." "It is. Just as serious as allegations that a $13 billion procurement decision may have been improperly influenced by personal relationships between program officials and the winning contractor." Wilson studied Patterson for a long moment before responding. "You understand that we're required to investigate all credible allegations of misconduct, regardless of their source or target." "I would expect nothing less. Though I would also expect that the substantial allegations contained in today's media reports would warrant at least as much investigative energy as is currently being directed at identifying their source." A knock at the door interrupted their increasingly tense exchange. One of the junior agents answered it, spoke briefly with someone outside, then returned to whisper something to Wilson. The senior agent's expression shifted almost imperceptibly from confidence to concern. "It appears we'll need to temporarily suspend this interview, Captain Patterson. A matter has arisen that requires our immediate attention." Patterson maintained a neutral expression, though he suspected he knew exactly what matter had developed. Sarah's story was gaining traction, likely reaching levels that demanded a more substantive response than simply identifying and intimidating the source. "Of course. Am I free to leave?" Wilson hesitated, clearly weighing his options. "We may need to continue our conversation at a later time. For now, you're free to go, but please remain available for further questions." "I have no plans to leave the area before tomorrow," Patterson assured him, rising from his chair with deliberate calm, "though I would appreciate the return of my phone." Once outside the building, Patterson checked his phone to find multiple missed calls and text messages from both Jason and Sarah. He called his grandson first. "Grandpa, are you all right?" Jason answered immediately. "I'm fine. Just finished a preliminary inquiry with some IG investigators. Where are you?" "We're at Sarah's hotel. It's been crazy. Her story is everywhere. CNN, Fox, all the major outlets are running with it. Congressional representatives are already calling for hearings. Senator Harrington from the Armed Services Committee just issued a statement demanding all ICCP documentation be preserved and submitted to his committee by close of business tomorrow." "Good. That's very good." Patterson felt a surge of cautious optimism. What about Colonel Harper? Were you able to reach him? Yes, sir. He said to tell you Thunderbolt is acknowledged and that he's mobilizing the cavalry, whatever that means. Patterson allowed himself a small smile. Jim Harper had always had a flair for the dramatic, but he was also one of the most respected combat arms officers in the Army, currently commanding the National Training Center, where he controlled the training and evaluation of every brigade combat team in the force. His voice, added to the growing chorus of concerns, would carry significant weight. It means we have powerful allies, Jason. Tell Sarah I'll meet you at her hotel in 30 minutes. And be careful, we've stirred up a hornet's nest today. Patterson ended the call and took a moment to assess his situation. The Inspector General's team had clearly been deployed as an intimidation tactic, likely at the direction of someone within the program office who had anticipated the story breaking. That they had released him so quickly suggested the strategy had backfired, the rapidly growing public attention making any appearance of witness intimidation politically untenable. He was about to call for a taxi when a familiar voice called his name. Turning, he saw Carol Henderson approaching cautiously from a nearby building. Ms. Henderson, I'm surprised to see you here. She glanced around nervously before speaking. I took personal leave today. Couldn't bear to be in the program office when the announcement was made. Then I saw the Defense Analytics article. Are you all right? Patterson asked, noting her evident anxiety. I've been better. They're on a witch hunt back at the Pentagon. Full lockdown of all ICCP documentation, computer access restricted, impromptu security briefings about the unauthorized disclosure of controlled, unclassified information. She lowered her voice further. They're pulling digital access logs, email records, everything. Patterson frowned. Have you been questioned? Not yet, but it's only a matter of time. I reported directly to Colonel Williams, who handled the test data integration. They'll work their way to me eventually. Do you have somewhere safe you can go? Family, friends outside the D.C. area? Henderson nodded. My sister lives in Colorado. I've already booked a flight for tomorrow morning. Good. Use personal credit cards, not government travel cards. Switch phones if possible. Patterson saw fear flash across her face and softened his tone. It's just a precaution. This is still America. Whistleblower protections exist. But the next few days will be challenging as they try to contain this situation. I never thought it would come to this, she said quietly. I believed in the system, in the process. Most of us did, still do, in its fundamental principles. It's the corruption of that process we're fighting against, not the process itself. Patterson gestured toward the road. I need to meet Sarah Mitchell. Can I drop you somewhere? Henderson shook her head. Better if we're not seen together. I have a rental car. She hesitated, then extended her hand. Thank you, Captain Patterson, for standing up when it would have been easier to stay silent. Patterson shook her hand firmly. Thank you for your courage, Ms. Henderson. History may never know your name, but the soldiers who will fight in whatever vehicle eventually emerges from this controversy will owe you their lives. After Henderson departed, Patterson arranged transportation to Sarah's hotel, his mind processing the rapidly evolving situation with the tactical clarity that had served him well in combat. The initial phase of their operation had succeeded beyond expectations, with Sarah's reporting creating a media firestorm and prompting congressional attention. But the counterattack was already beginning, focused on discrediting the source rather than addressing the substance of the allegations. The next 24 hours would be critical. If momentum faltered, if the news cycle moved on, if the department managed to frame this as merely a disgruntled contractor protest or the act of a rogue employee, then the behemoth program would proceed despite its flaws. If, however, they could sustain attention and expand the scope of concern beyond this single procurement decision to the larger issues of acquisition, integrity, and conflicts of interest, then real reform might be possible. Sarah's hotel lobby bustled with activity when Patterson arrived. Several other journalists had apparently chosen the same location as their base of operations, creating an impromptu press center in the public spaces. Patterson navigated through the crowd to the elevators, taking one to the fourth floor where Jason had indicated Sarah's room was located. His grandson answered his knock immediately, ushering him into a room that had been transformed into an operational headquarters. Papers were spread across every surface, 2 laptops displayed different news channels, and Sarah paced the room with a phone to her ear, engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation with an editor or producer. They deployed the IG investigators, Patterson said to Jason after the door closed. Tried to intimidate me into revealing sources. Did they threaten charges? Not explicitly. It was more a show of force than a serious investigative effort. They backed off as soon as the story started gaining national attention. Patterson surveyed the organized chaos of the room. How's Sarah holding up? Like a champion. She's been nonstop since we got here. 3 television interviews by remote, countless calls with other journalists and congressional staffers. Jason's admiration was evident. I've been helping organize the document references and preparing briefing materials for her appearances. Sarah concluded her call and turned to Patterson. Bob, thank God you're all right. When Jason told me they'd taken you in for questioning, standard intimidation tactics, Patterson assured her. Nothing to worry about. What's the current status? Sarah gestured to the televisions. The story has broken through to mainstream coverage. All major networks, all major newspapers. Congressional reaction has been swift and bipartisan, which is practically miraculous in the current political environment. The money involved crosses party lines, Patterson observed. $13 billion touches a lot of congressional districts. Exactly. Senator Harrington has announced Armed Services Committee hearings beginning next week. The House Oversight Committee is making similar noises. Atlas Defense stock dropped 11% before trading was temporarily halted. And the department's response? Official statement acknowledges concerns raised about the evaluation process and promises to review all relevant documentation to ensure full compliance with acquisition regulations. Unofficial response through background channels is more combative, suggesting the allegations represent sour grapes from the losing contractor and misunderstanding of the complex technical factors involved in the decision. Patterson nodded, unsurprised. They'll try to bury this in technical minutiae, frame it as too complex for public understanding, drag out any investigations until media attention fades. Which is why we need to keep the pressure on, Sarah said, gesturing to a notepad filled with contact information. I've got commitments for continued coverage from major outlets through the weekend. The key is sustaining momentum into next week when Congress can really engage. Jason, who had been monitoring social media reactions on his phone, looked up with concern. Atlas is pushing back hard. They've got surrogates on all the financial channels arguing that the behemoth contract is essential for national security and that any delay threatens American military readiness. Classic defense contractor playbook, Patterson said dismissively. Wrap yourself in the flag, claim any criticism endangers the troops. It's effective because it contains a grain of truth. We do need to modernize our armor, just not with an overpriced, underperforming platform chosen through a compromise process. A notification chimed on Sarah's laptop. She checked it quickly, her expression brightening. Colonel Harper just issued a statement. He's calling for a thorough, independent review of the ICCP test data by operational commands with recent combat experience. Says he has serious concerns about the combat effectiveness of the selected platform based on his experience commanding armor in Iraq and Afghanistan. Patterson allowed himself a small smile. The cavalry has indeed arrived. Is he really that influential? Jason asked. Jim Harper commands the National Training Center. Every combat brigade in the Army rotates through his command for evaluation. He's trained more combat units than anyone in the modern force, and he's known as someone who tells hard truths about combat readiness, even when they're unpopular. Sarah was already incorporating this new development into her notes. This could be the turning point. A serving colonel with Harper's credentials changes the dynamic from disgruntled former advisor to serious institutional concerns. Their strategy session was interrupted by Patterson's phone ringing. He checked the caller ID, his expression turning grave. It's General Blackwood. The room fell silent as Patterson answered, putting the call on speaker. Blackwood, Bob, the general's voice carried forced casualness. We need to talk. I believe we're talking now. In person. This situation has gotten out of hand. There are aspects of the ICCP decision that weren't appropriate for public disclosure, contexts that are missing from the current media coverage. Patterson exchanged glances with Sarah, who nodded encouragingly. I'm listening. Not over the phone. Meet me at the officers' club in 30 minutes. Just you and me, off the record. Like old times. The transparent attempt at appealing to their shared history might have been effective once, before Patterson had seen the evidence of Blackwood's corruption. Now it felt hollow, manipulative. What exactly do you want to discuss, William? The adjusted test parameters that artificially favored Behemoth? the undisclosed meetings with Atlas executives, or perhaps your post-retirement employment plans. A weighted silence hung over the connection before Blackwood responded, his tone hardening. You don't understand the bigger picture, Bob. There are strategic considerations that go beyond test results and technical specifications. Enlighten me then, here now. This isn't a conversation to have over an unsecured line. Yet you're willing to have it at the Officers Club, a public venue where anyone might overhear? That suggests you're less concerned with security than with meeting somewhere your authority would be enhanced by the setting. Blackwood's frustration became audible. Damn it, Bob, I'm trying to give you a chance to walk this back before it destroys both our reputations and undermines a critical national security program. My reputation rests on 40 years of honorable service, including combat command in 3 conflicts. I'm comfortable with how history will judge my actions. Patterson's voice remained steady, resolute. The question is whether you're comfortable with how yours will be judged once the full extent of Atlas's influence over the ICCP decision becomes public. You're making a serious mistake, Bob. There are larger forces at work here than you realize. That sounds remarkably like a threat, General. It's a reality check from an old friend. Blackwood's tone softened, attempting a different approach. We've known each other since we were cadets, fought together, bled together. Don't throw away that history over a procurement disagreement. Patterson closed his eyes briefly, feeling the weight of their shared past. When he spoke again, his voice carried not anger, but profound disappointment. It stopped being a procurement disagreement when you allowed personal gain to influence a decision that will affect thousands of young Americans' lives in combat. When you betrayed everything we once stood for. The line went silent for several seconds. When Blackwood finally responded, all pretense of friendship had vanished. You've made your choice then. Don't expect any further professional courtesies. I expect you to face the consequences of your actions with the same courage we once expected of ourselves as young officers. Goodbye, William. Patterson ended the call, the weight of 40 years of friendship collapsing into a void of betrayal and disillusionment. He looked up to find Jason and Sarah watching him with a mixture of concern and admiration. He's desperate, Sarah observed. That was an attempt to contain the damage, maybe offer you some kind of deal. Or get me alone to present more direct threats, Patterson added grimly. Either way, it confirms we've struck a nerve. The story is too big to suppress through normal channels now. Jason had been checking news updates during the call. General Blackwood has just been temporarily reassigned pending review of ICCP program management, according to a Pentagon statement. They're moving into damage control mode. Sacrificial lamb strategy, Sarah nodded. Remove the most visible figure, promise a full investigation, hope the story dies down while they proceed with the contract under new management. Meanwhile, Atlas preserves the $13 billion award, Patterson concluded. Classic containment approach. Sarah resumed her pacing, the investigative instincts that had made her reputation now fully engaged. We need to broaden the scope beyond Blackwood. Show this is systemic, not just one officer's ethical lapse. The documents from Henderson help with that, Jason pointed out. They show multiple program officials involved in manipulating the evaluation criteria. And we need to emphasize the real-world implications, Patterson added. This isn't about bureaucratic processes or regulatory compliance. It's about whether American soldiers will have the right vehicle when they go into combat. A knock at the door interrupted their strategizing. Jason checked through the peephole, then opened it to reveal Colonel Jim Harper, still in the desert tan uniform he wore at the National Training Center. Jim, Patterson greeted him with genuine warmth, clasping his former executive officer's hand firmly. You made good time from California. Caught a military transport as soon as I saw the news breaking, Harper replied, his weathered face showing the effects of decades in the sun and sand of Fort Irwin. He nodded to Sarah. Ms. Mitchell, your reporting is causing quite the stir. Colonel Harper, thank you for your public statement. It adds significant credibility to our concerns. Harper turned to Jason, taking in the young lieutenant's bearing and features. And you must be Jason. The resemblance to your grandfather is remarkable. Sir, Jason straightened reflexively in the presence of a senior officer. It's an honor to meet you. I've studied your training doctrine at the academy. At ease, Lieutenant. We're all on the same side here. Harper turned his attention back to Patterson. The situation is escalating quickly, Bob. The Chief of Staff has convened an emergency review panel. Multiple congressional committees are demanding documentation. Atlas is mobilizing every ally they have in Washington. And the operational commands? The actual units who would fight in these vehicles? Harper's expression was grim. Mixed. Senior leaders are cautious, waiting to see which way the wind blows. Company-grade officers and NCOs, the ones who would actually command these things in combat, are solidly skeptical of the behemoth. Word of its poor mobility performance in realistic conditions has filtered throughout the armor community. Sarah had been taking notes. Would any of those company-grade officers or NCOs be willing to speak on record about their concerns? That's one reason I'm here, Harper replied. I've got a list of combat-experienced tank commanders willing to provide statements about the practical requirements for modern armor operations. Men and women who've actually fought in Abrams tanks in Iraq and Afghanistan, who understand the real-world constraints and challenges. Patterson nodded approvingly. Expanding the circle of concern, moving this beyond me, beyond any suggestion that this is a personal vendetta or a contractor dispute. Exactly. And I've brought something else. Harper removed a tablet from his briefcase and activated it, displaying a series of video clips. Training footage from the National Training Center showing prototype behemoth vehicles during evaluation exercises, specifically showing their mobility limitations in urban terrain, their vulnerability to modern anti-tank weapons due to their size and their deployment challenges. Sarah moved closer, her reporter's instincts recognizing the value of visual evidence. Is this cleared for public release? It's unclassified training footage, created specifically to evaluate combat systems and doctrine. Harper's expression showed grim satisfaction. Nothing in these clips reveals sensitive capabilities or vulnerabilities beyond what any potential adversary already knows from basic physics and military common sense. A 70-ton vehicle has certain unavoidable limitations in soft terrain, confined spaces, and narrow bridges. As the group gathered around the tablet, the footage showed a behemoth prototype struggling to navigate a simulated urban environment, its bulk preventing it from accessing narrow streets where simulated enemy forces lurked. Another clip displayed a behemoth becoming immobilized in soft desert terrain, requiring recovery vehicles to extract it while simulated enemy fire poured into its exposed position. The Army spent millions creating this training center precisely to evaluate how equipment and tactics perform in realistic conditions, Harper explained. These results should have been definitive in the evaluation process, yet somehow they were minimized or disregarded in the final analysis. Patterson watched the footage with the experienced eye of a tank commander, seeing not just the technical failures, but the tactical implications for soldiers who would depend on these vehicles in combat. This is damning, Jim. No combat experienced officer would choose this platform after seeing these results, which is why they were buried in technical appendices and weighted less significantly than stationary firepower tests and frontal armor protection metrics, Harper confirmed. The decision was skewed toward a World War III scenario on the plains of Europe that hasn't been our primary combat reality for 30 years. Sarah was already mentally composing her next article. Colonel, would you be willing to narrate these clips for a video segment? Explain exactly what we're seeing and why it matters from the perspective of someone who trains combat units. Harper nodded without hesitation. That's why I brought them. The American people deserve to understand what their tax dollars are buying and what trade-offs are being made with their sons' and daughters' lives. For the next hour, they collaborated on integrating this new material into their strategic approach. Harper provided expert commentary for Sarah's camera, explaining in clear, accessible language why the behemoth's performance deficiencies mattered in real-world combat conditions. Jason compiled a list of specific questions for congressional staffers to raise during the upcoming hearings, highlighting the most problematic aspects of the evaluation process. Patterson coordinated their efforts while maintaining communication with other potential allies, reaching out to retired officers whose voices might add further weight to their concerns. The hotel room had become an impromptu command center for what amounted to a counteroffensive against a corrupted procurement process. As evening approached, Sarah's phone rang. She answered, listened briefly, then covered the receiver. It's my editor. Atlas Defense has issued a cease and desist letter demanding we remove the article and video clips, claiming they contain proprietary information and misrepresent the vehicle's capabilities. Harper snorted derisively. Standard intimidation tactic, those clips show their vehicle performing in an official government evaluation on a military installation. There's nothing proprietary about failure. Sarah relayed this assessment to her editor, then continued listening as he apparently provided additional information. Her expression grew increasingly concerned. "What is it?" Patterson asked as she ended the call. "Atlas isn't just targeting the media. They've filed an ethics complaint against Colonel Harper with the department, alleging he's disclosed controlled unclassified information without authorization. And their hair suggesting your involvement, Bob, represents a conflict of interest due to alleged connections with a competing contractor." Harper appeared entirely unperturbed by this development. Predictable. When you can't refute the message, attack the messenger. "What connections with the competing contractor?" Patterson demanded, genuinely baffled. Sarah grimaced. "They're claiming your son-in-law once worked as a subcontractor for a company that supplies components to Dynamic Systems, the Raptor's manufacturer. David? He's an electrical engineer who worked for a dozen different defense contractors over his career, along with commercial aviation firms. I haven't discussed the ICCP with him once." "It doesn't matter if it's true," Harper pointed out. "It only matters if it muddies the waters enough to distract from the substantive issues." Jason had been monitoring online reaction to their continuing revelations. Twitter is divided, a lot of support from veterans and active duty personnel who understand the real-world implications, but there's also an organized pushback claiming this is all politically motivated to undermine American military strength. "Atlas has a well-funded social media operation," Sarah confirmed. "They're activating it now to control the narrative." Patterson absorbed this development with the calm assessment of a battlefield commander receiving reconnaissance reports. So their counteroffensive has three fronts: legal intimidation of media outlets, ethical attacks on military critics, and public narrative manipulation through social media. "Standard playbook when billions are at stake," Harper agreed. "I've seen it before on smaller programs." "So what's our next move?" Jason asked, looking between the three older, more experienced individuals. Patterson considered the situation carefully. "We need to consolidate our position before their counter-narrative gains traction. Sarah publishes the footage with Colonel Harper's expert analysis tonight, reaching the broadest possible audience before any legal challenges can be adjudicated. Jason coordinates with congressional staff to ensure they have specific, technically accurate questions prepared for next week's hearings. And I reach out to my contacts at the Combat Arms Center to mobilize additional operational experts who can validate our concerns." "Divide and conquer," Harper nodded approvingly, "making it impossible to silence all channels simultaneously." "Exactly. We create too many points of resistance for them to suppress with legal threats or character assassination." Sarah was already preparing her equipment to record Harper's commentary on the training footage. "I'll have this ready to publish within 2 hours, with distribution across all our platforms and sharing arrangements with major networks." Jason began organizing his notes for congressional staff briefings. "I'll focus on the technical aspects that are hardest to refute, pure physics and logistics that can't be dismissed as opinion or preference." As the team engaged in their respective tasks, Patterson stepped into the hallway to make several calls to former colleagues now serving in key positions within the Army's training and doctrine commands. The response was cautious but supportive, with several agreeing to review the evidence and potentially add their voices to the growing chorus of concern. When he returned to the room, the atmosphere had shifted from reactive defense to proactive campaign. Harper was delivering precise, compelling commentary on the behemoth's performance failures. His decades of experience, evident in his ability to translate complex military concepts into accessible explanations for a civilian audience. Sarah captured everything with professional skill, already mentally editing the most impactful sequences for maximum effect. "This isn't just about one procurement decision, no matter how significant," Harper was saying as Patterson re-entered. "This is about whether our acquisition system serves the soldiers who will fight in these vehicles or the contractors who build them. It's about whether combat effectiveness takes precedence over political considerations and profit margins." Patterson watched with quiet pride as his former subordinate articulated the fundamental principles at stake. This was why he had initiated this fight, knowing the personal and professional costs it might entail. Not out of bitterness or resentment, not from wounded pride at having his advice ignored, but from the deep conviction that the system meant to equip America's warriors had lost sight of its essential purpose. As Harper concluded his commentary, he looked to Patterson with the same expression of determined resolve they had shared decades earlier on the sands of Iraq, facing Republican Guard armor across an empty desert. The stakes were different now, the battlefield transformed from physical terrain to institutional and informational landscapes. But the fundamental duty remained unchanged, to ensure that when American soldiers went into harm's way, they did so with the best possible equipment, selected through an honest process that prioritized their lives and mission accomplishment above all other considerations. The night stretched on as they worked, each focused on their piece of the emerging campaign. Outside, the media storm continued to build, with new revelations and reactions appearing hourly. Atlas Defense's stock continued its decline despite the company's aggressive countermeasures. Congressional offices issued increasingly pointed statements demanding transparency and accountability. Military forums buzzed with technical discussions from current and former armor personnel, most expressing serious reservations about the behemoth's suitability for modern combat operations. Around midnight, as Sarah finalized her video package and prepared to transmit it to her network, Jason approached his grandfather with a troubled expression. "Something's bothering me," he said quietly, leading Patterson to a corner where they could speak privately. "This feels like it's working, like we're actually changing the outcome. But what happens to all the people involved when the dust settles? Henderson risked her career. Colonel Harper might face disciplinary action. Your friendship with General Blackwood is destroyed. Even I might face subtle repercussions as a new lieutenant known to be involved in this controversy." Patterson studied his grandson's face, seeing in it the same thoughtful concern for consequences that had always characterized his own leadership style. "Every significant choice has costs, Jason. The question isn't whether there will be consequences, but whether they're worth bearing for the principle at stake. And you believe they are in this case." It wasn't a question, but Patterson answered it anyway. "I believe the integrity of the system that equips our nation's defenders is worth fighting for, yes, even at personal cost." Jason nodded slowly. "I agree. I guess I'm realizing that moral courage can be harder than physical courage in some ways. In combat, decisions happen in moments, with adrenaline and training carrying you through. This kind of fight requires sustaining that courage over days, weeks, maybe months." "That's very insightful," Patterson said, genuine pride evident in his voice. "And entirely correct. Moral courage is a marathon, not a sprint. It requires endurance that physical courage often doesn't." Their conversation was interrupted by Sarah calling for their attention. "It's done. The package is uploaded and will go live at 6 a.m. Eastern, prime time for the morning news cycle." Harper, who had been reviewing the final cut, nodded with satisfaction. "Well done. Clear, compelling, and technically accurate. That combination is surprisingly rare in defense reporting." "What now?" Jason asked, looking around at their impromptu war room, strewn with notes, devices, and the remnants of hastily consumed meals. "Now we rest," Patterson said firmly. "Tomorrow will bring a new phase of this campaign, and we'll need clear heads and renewed energy to meet it." As they prepared to disperse for the night, Patterson found himself reflecting on the strange turns his life had taken. He had joined the Army as a young man seeking purpose and challenge, found both in the discipline of armor warfare, and built a career on the principle that leadership meant putting the mission and your soldiers above personal ambition or comfort. Now, decades later, and ostensibly in retirement, he found himself leading a different kind of mission, fighting with information rather than firepower, but still fundamentally guided by the same core principle, that some things were worth fighting for, regardless of the personal cost. As he watched his grandson gathering his notes, Patterson saw in him the continuation of that legacy, not just the family tradition of military service, but the deeper commitment to integrity and moral courage that gave such service its meaning and value. Whatever happened with the ICCP decision, whatever professional price they might pay for their stand, that legacy would endure. And that, ultimately, was victory enough. Morning sunlight streamed through the hotel room blinds as Robert Patterson reviewed the latest developments on his tablet. In the scant 6 hours since Sarah Mitchell's video package had gone live, featuring Colonel Harper's expert analysis of the behemoth's performance failures, the story had evolved from a defense industry controversy to a full-blown national scandal. The major networks were running special segments. Congressional representatives from both parties were issuing statements demanding accountability. Social media buzzed with active duty and veteran service members weighing in on the controversy, the vast majority expressing concern about the selected platform's suitability for modern combat operations. A soft knock at the door announced Jason's arrival. The young lieutenant looked remarkably composed despite the minimal sleep and enormous pressure of recent days. "Morning, Grandpa. Have you seen the latest?" Patterson nodded, gesturing to his tablet. Atlas stock down another 14%. Trading halted again. Three congressional committees have announced hearings. The Secretary of Defense has scheduled a press conference for noon. And this just broke 20 minutes ago, Jason added, showing Patterson his phone. The Inspector General has announced a formal investigation into the ICCP evaluation process, with specific focus on potential conflicts of interest and procedural irregularities. Patterson allowed himself a small, grim smile. So the system is responding as it should. Yes, sir. Jason sat on the edge of the bed, his expression thoughtful. Do you think it will be enough? Will they actually reverse the decision? Patterson considered the question carefully. That depends on how deeply the corruption has penetrated. If it's limited to Blackwood and a few program officials, then yes, I believe a reversal is possible. If the influence extends to higher levels of the department or Congress, they'll find ways to modify the behemoth design rather than admit the fundamental concept was flawed. Their conversation was interrupted by Patterson's phone ringing. Sarah Mitchell's name flashed on the screen. Patterson, he answered, putting the call on speaker. Bob, are you watching CNN? Sarah's voice carried the energized tension of a reporter in the midst of a breaking story. No, what's happening? General Blackwood just resigned, effective immediately, cited personal reasons and the need to avoid any appearance of impropriety that might distract from the important work of the department. Patterson exchanged a significant look with his grandson. A resignation before the formal investigation even begins suggests he knows what they'll find. Exactly, and there's more. Anonymous sources within the Pentagon are saying a full review of the ICCP decision has been ordered by the Secretary himself, with a mandated focus on operational suitability rather than just technical specifications. They're creating the conditions for a reversal, Patterson observed, establishing the narrative that will allow them to change course without admitting the original decision was corrupt. Classic damage control, Sarah agreed, but it only works if they actually fix the underlying problem. Speaking of which, I've just received an invitation to attend the Secretary's press conference as a recognized defense industry reporter. Care to join me as my technical expert? Patterson considered the offer. That would be highly unusual. Press conferences normally don't include outside technical experts. These aren't normal circumstances, and having you there visibly present as the whistleblower whose concerns have been validated creates a powerful image they'll have trouble controlling. A psychological operation, Jason murmured with grudging admiration. Patterson nodded slowly. Very well, but Jason should maintain his distance. His involvement needs to remain deniable for the sake of his career. Sarah accepted this condition. Meet me in the hotel lobby in 30 minutes. And Bob, wear your ribbon rack, all of it. After ending the call, Patterson turned to find Jason watching him with a mixture of pride and concern. You don't have to protect my career, Grandpa. I'm all in on this, whatever the consequences. I know you are, and I'm prouder of you than I can express. Patterson placed a hand on his grandson's shoulder. But there's a difference between moral courage and unnecessary sacrifice. Your generation of officers will be responsible for implementing whatever reforms come from this controversy. You need to be in position to ensure that happens properly. Jason accepted this reasoning with reluctance. What should I do while you're at the press conference? Continue coordinating with Colonel Harper's people. Organize the material for the congressional hearings, and be ready to move quickly depending on what the Secretary announces today. As Patterson prepared for the press conference, selecting a suit that would accommodate the impressive array of ribbons that testified to his decades of service and combat experience, he found himself reflecting on how quickly events had accelerated. Just days ago, he had been a retired officer whose concerns were being systematically marginalized. Now he stood at the center of a controversy that might fundamentally reshape how the defense acquisition system functioned. The stakes had grown accordingly. This was no longer just about one procurement decision, however significant. It had become a referendum on whether the institutions responsible for equipping America's military could be trusted to prioritize combat effectiveness over political connections and profit motives, on whether the system could self-correct when evidence of corruption emerged, on whether moral courage still mattered in American public life. 30 minutes later, Patterson met Sarah in the hotel lobby. Her professional demeanor couldn't quite conceal her excitement at covering what was rapidly becoming one of the biggest defense procurement stories in decades. You look like you're headed to a court-martial, she observed, noting his formal appearance in the rows of ribbons that included the Silver Star, Bronze Star with Valor, and Purple Heart among numerous campaign and service decorations. In a sense, I am, Patterson replied, but not as the accused. They traveled to the Pentagon in silence, each absorbed in preparation for what promised to be a pivotal moment in the unfolding controversy. The press briefing room was already filled beyond capacity when they arrived, with journalists from every major news organization jostling for position. Sarah's credentials secured them access, though Patterson's presence drew curious glances from Pentagon staff. As they found their seats, Patterson noted the unusual composition of the gathered officials on the small stage. Besides the expected presence of the Secretary of Defense and the department's chief spokesperson, several senior military officers were in attendance, including the Army Chief of Staff and, surprisingly, the Commander of Forces Command, who oversaw all operational Army units. "They've brought the war fighters," Patterson murmured to Sarah, "not just the acquisition officials." "That's significant." Sarah nodded, already taking notes, creating the impression that operational requirements are being prioritized. The room quieted as the secretary approached the podium, his expression appropriately grave for the occasion. The secretary was a former corporate executive with limited military experience, known primarily as a skilled manager and political operator, rather than a strategic thinker or defense expert. "Good afternoon," Aide began. "I've called this press conference to address the recent concerns that have emerged regarding the Infantry Combat Capability Program, specifically the selection process that resulted in the award of a contract to Atlas Defense Corporation for their behemoth combat platform." Camera shutters clicked rapidly as he continued. "First, I want to acknowledge the legitimate questions that have been raised about the evaluation criteria and testing methodology employed during the selection process. Transparency and integrity are essential to maintaining public trust in our defense acquisition system, and any substantiated improprieties must be addressed swiftly and completely." Patterson noted the careful wording. Substantiated improprieties created room for dismissing concerns that couldn't be definitively proven, regardless of their merit. To that end, I am announcing 3 specific actions effective immediately. First, I have accepted the resignation of Lieutenant General William Blackwood as Program Executive Officer for ICCP. Second, I have directed the Inspector General to conduct a comprehensive investigation into all aspects of the ICCP evaluation and selection process. Third, I have ordered a temporary suspension of the contract award pending the results of an independent technical assessment of both competing platforms, with specific emphasis on operational suitability in likely combat scenarios. A murmur ran through the assembled press corps. While stopping short of canceling the contract outright, the secretary had effectively pressed pause on the entire program, creating space for a potential change in direction. This independent assessment will be led by a panel of combat experienced officers and NCOs drawn from operational units, complemented by technical experts from outside the acquisition community. Their evaluation will focus on practical battlefield considerations rather than theoretical performance metrics. Patterson exchanged a look with Sarah. This was a clear response to Colonel Harper's criticisms, embracing his central argument that actual combat requirements had been subordinated to abstract technical specifications in the original evaluation. "I want to emphasize that these actions should not be interpreted as prejudging the outcome of the Inspector General's investigation or the technical reassessment. Our only agenda is ensuring that American soldiers have the best possible equipment for their mission, selected through a process of unimpeachable integrity." The secretary concluded his prepared remarks and opened the floor to questions. The first came from a veteran Pentagon correspondent from the Washington Post. "Mr. Secretary, given the serious allegations surrounding the ICCP decision, why not simply cancel the contract and restart the competition with enhanced oversight?" The secretary maintained his composed demeanor. "Canceling a contract of this magnitude carries significant legal and financial implications, including potential litigation that could delay fielding a needed capability even longer. The approach I've outlined allows for a thorough review while preserving all options depending on what that review discovers." Another reporter called out, "Is there any truth to reports that General Blackwood maintained undisclosed relationships with Atlas defense executives during the evaluation period?" "That is precisely the type of allegation the Inspector General will investigate," the secretary replied smoothly. "It would be inappropriate for me to comment on specific claims before that investigation is complete." Sarah raised her hand and was recognized. Mr. Secretary, the concerns about the behemoth platform's operational suitability were raised by multiple combat experienced officers during the evaluation process, including Captain Robert Patterson, who is here today. She gestured toward Patterson, drawing the room's attention to his presence. Yet those concerns were systematically marginalized. What assurance can you provide that the new assessment will genuinely prioritize the perspective of those with actual combat experience over political or industrial considerations? The Secretary's gaze shifted to Patterson, recognition flickering across his features as he noted the impressive display of combat decorations. A momentary silence fell over the room as reporters turned to observe the retired tank commander whose whistleblowing had catalyzed the growing scandal. Captain Patterson's service record speaks for itself, the Secretary finally acknowledged, and his concerns, along with those of other experienced officers, deserve serious consideration. That's precisely why I've directed that the reassessment panel be composed primarily of combat veterans with relevant experience. Furthermore, I've instructed that the panel's findings be made public to the maximum extent possible without compromising classified capabilities. This last commitment, seemingly improvised in response to being confronted with Patterson's physical presence, represented a significant departure from normal procedure. Making the panel's findings public would make it far more difficult to ignore or minimize inconvenient conclusions. The questioning continued for another 30 minutes, with the Secretary and his military colleagues providing carefully calibrated responses that acknowledged concerns without admitting systemic failures or personal culpability. Throughout, Patterson remained a silent but powerful presence, his very existence in the room a reminder of the human consequences behind the bureaucratic and technical discussions. As the press conference concluded, several reporters approached Patterson seeking comments or interviews. Sarah skillfully deflected most, though Patterson agreed to a brief statement for her network. My only concern throughout this process has been ensuring that the young men and women who will fight in these vehicles have the best possible equipment for their mission, he stated with characteristic directness. I'm encouraged that the department appears to be taking these concerns seriously, and I look forward to seeing a thorough, honest reassessment that prioritizes combat effectiveness over all other considerations. As they exited the Pentagon, Sarah was already composing her story, while Patterson absorbed the implications of what they had witnessed. They're creating a path to reverse the decision without admitting corruption, he observed. The independent assessment will conclude the Raptor is more suitable for modern combat operations, allowing them to change course while preserving institutional reputation. Sarah nodded, her fingers flying across her phone's keyboard. Classic damage control, but it only works if they actually follow through. If the assessment is manipulated or ignored, we'll be right back where we started. Which is why we need to maintain pressure through the congressional hearings and media coverage, Patterson agreed. This isn't over yet, not by a long shot. Upon returning to the hotel, they found Jason and Colonel Harper reviewing the press conference coverage on multiple devices. The young lieutenant's expression brightened at their arrival. Well played, Grandpa. Your presence at that press conference was a masterstroke. Sarah's idea, not mine, Patterson deflected, though he understood the psychological impact his appearance had created. What's the broader reaction? Harper gestured to one of the laptops. Military forums are overwhelmingly positive. Active duty armor officers and NCOs are particularly vocal, most expressing relief that operational requirements might finally take precedence over procurement politics. An Atlas? Sarah asked, setting up her own equipment to file her story. Stock down another 12% before trading was halted again, Jason reported. Their PR machine is working overtime, emphasizing Behemoth's advanced technology and protection features, while downplaying mobility and deployment concerns. Congressional reaction is mixed, Harper added. Representatives from districts with Atlas facilities expressing concern about the process, while emphasizing the need to maintain program momentum. Others praising the Secretary's decision as responsible oversight and appropriate diligence. Patterson absorbed this information with the tactical assessment skills honed through decades of military service. The battle lines are forming. Atlas and their political allies will work to contain this to Blackwood personally, portraying him as a rogue actor while preserving the contract award. Meanwhile, operational commands and combat arms officers will push for genuine reassessment based on battlefield requirements. Harper continued, completing the analysis. The next week will determine which faction prevails. "What's our next move?" Jason asked, his expression reflecting the same focused determination Patterson had seen in so many young officers facing their first major combat operation. "We prepare for the congressional hearings," Patterson replied. "That's where the public narrative will solidify. If committee members ask the right questions and demand the right documents, the systemic nature of the corruption becomes impossible to deny or contain." The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparation and strategic coordination. Patterson worked with Sarah to compile the most compelling evidence for various congressional committees. Jason organized technical briefings that translated complex military specifications into terms civilian representatives could understand. Colonel Harper mobilized a network of combat experience officers willing to provide testimony about modern armor requirements. Throughout, they monitored the Pentagon's actions closely for any sign that the promised reassessment was being compromised or undermined. The announcement of the assessment panel's composition provided cautious reassurance. It included several respected combat commanders with recent deployment experience, balanced by technical experts known for their independence from defense industry influence. The morning of the first congressional hearing dawned clear and cool. The Senate Armed Services Committee had claimed jurisdiction as the primary oversight body for major defense acquisitions, scheduling testimony from department officials, Atlas executives, and independent experts, including Patterson himself. As they prepared in Sarah's hotel room, which had become their de facto headquarters, the atmosphere was tense but focused, like a tank crew preparing for combat. "Remember, they'll try to frame this as a technical disagreement rather than a corruption issue," Patterson advised Jason, who would be attending as an observer. "Complex acquisition processes, competing technical priorities, legitimate differences of professional opinion, all designed to obscure the simple fact that test results were manipulated to favor a predetermined outcome. And they'll attack your credibility," Sarah added, reviewing her notes. "Suggest personal animus toward Blackwood. Hint at connections to the competing contractor. Question why you waited until after the decision to go public." Patterson nodded grimly. "Standard playbook. Discredit the whistleblower when you can't refute the evidence." "We've anticipated all those angles in your prepared testimony," Jason assured him, holding up a binder of carefully organized documentation. "Direct references to original test data, contemporaneous records of your concerns raised during the process, emails showing the systematic marginalization of operational perspectives. And I'll be there to document everything," Sarah promised. "Live updates, immediate fact-checking if they misrepresent the evidence." Their planning was interrupted by Patterson's phone ringing. The caller ID showed a Pentagon number he didn't recognize. "Patterson," he answered cautiously. "Captain Patterson, this is Major General Thomas Crawford, Deputy Inspector General. I'm calling to inform you that we've completed the initial phase of our investigation into the ICCP decision process." Patterson put the call on speaker so the others could hear. "That was remarkably fast, General. Certain aspects of the case proved unambiguous." Crawford's tone suggested professional displeasure at what his investigation had uncovered. "We've confirmed multiple undisclosed meetings between General Blackwood and Atlas defense executives during the evaluation period. We've also identified serious irregularities in how test results were weighted and interpreted." "I appreciate your thoroughness, General. May I ask why you're informing me personally rather than through the normal channels?" "Because I've just submitted our preliminary findings to the Secretary, and they will be released publicly before today's hearing. I believed you deserved advance notice, given your role in bringing these matters to light." Patterson exchanged surprised glances with the others. The Inspector General's office rarely moved with such speed, and even more rarely released findings before an investigation was fully complete. "Thank you for the courtesy, General. Can you share any specific conclusions?" "Our preliminary report confirms that the evaluation process was inappropriately influenced by non-technical factors, including what appear to be explicit promises of post-retirement employment opportunities for certain program officials. We've also determined that test results showing Behemoth's mobility limitations in certain operational environments were deliberately downweighted in the final analysis." Sarah was already taking notes, her expression reflecting professional excitement at this developing story. "The Secretary has decided to take immediate action rather than wait for our final report," Crawford continued. "He'll be announcing the termination of the Behemoth contract and a restructuring of the entire ICCP approach within the hour." Patterson absorbed this information with carefully controlled emotion. "That's more decisive than I expected, General." The evidence was compelling, Ketan, and frankly, the department has concluded that proceeding with a compromised decision would cause more long-term damage to the acquisition system's credibility than admitting error and correcting course immediately. After ending the call, Patterson looked at his companions, seeing his own surprise reflected in their expressions. "They're cutting their losses," Sarah observed, recognizing that the evidence is too damning to defend. "And moving to get ahead of the congressional hearings," Harper added, announcing the contract termination before being publicly forced to do so. Jason seemed troubled despite this apparent victory. "But what about accountability? Does Blackwood just resign and walk away? Do the other officials involved face any consequences?" "The Inspector General's investigation continues," Patterson reminded him. "Criminal referrals remain possible if evidence of law-breaking emerges. But you're right to be concerned. Institutional self-preservation often outweighs full accountability." Their discussion was interrupted by breaking news alerts on all their devices. The Secretary of Defense was making an unscheduled announcement from the Pentagon. They gathered around Sarah's laptop to watch the live stream. The Secretary appeared solemn yet resolute as he addressed the assembled press corps. "Based on preliminary findings from the Inspector General's investigation into the Infantry Combat Capability Program, I have determined that the integrity of the selection process was compromised by inappropriate external influences and procedural irregularities." Camera flashes punctuated his carefully prepared statement. "Accordingly, I am directing the immediate termination of the contract with Atlas Defense Corporation for the Behemoth platform. Furthermore, I am ordering a fundamental restructuring of the ICCP approach to emphasize operational suitability, deployment flexibility, and cost-effectiveness in line with current and projected combat requirements." Murmurs rippled through the press corps as reporters absorbed the unprecedented nature of this reversal. "This decision reflects our unwavering commitment to providing America's soldiers with the best possible equipment, selected through a process of unimpeachable integrity. It is not a reflection on Atlas Defense's technical capabilities, but rather on the flawed process through which their platform was selected." Patterson noted the attempt to soften the blow to Atlas, likely in anticipation of the inevitable legal challenges and political backlash that would follow such a significant contract termination. "I have directed the establishment of a new selection approach that incorporates greater input from operational commands and combat experienced personnel, with enhanced transparency throughout the evaluation process. Additionally, I am implementing stricter ethics requirements for all acquisition personnel, including expanded recusal obligations and post-employment restrictions." As the Secretary continued outlining reforms to prevent similar problems in future procurement decisions, Patterson found himself experiencing an unexpected mixture of emotions. Vindication, certainly, but also a profound sense of something deeper. The reaffirmation that systems of accountability, however imperfect, could still function when citizens of courage forced them to confront uncomfortable truths. When the announcement concluded, the room fell silent for a moment before Sarah broke the spell. "You did it," she said simply, genuine admiration in her voice. "You actually changed the outcome." Patterson shook his head slightly. "We did it, all of us. And the system, flawed as it is, ultimately responded as it should." "So what happens now?" Jason asked. "With the Behemoth contract terminated, does Raptor automatically win?" "Unlikely," Harper answered. The Secretary mentioned restructuring the entire approach. They'll probably revise requirements based on lessons from this controversy, then conduct a new competition. But with operational suitability explicitly prioritized, Raptor or something very similar will almost certainly emerge as the winner. "And most importantly," Patterson added, "whatever vehicle eventually enters service will be selected for the right reasons, because it best meets the needs of the soldiers who will fight in it, not because it best serves political or corporate interests." The congressional hearing that afternoon took on a markedly different tone following the Secretary's announcement. Rather than focusing on the specific ICCP decision, committee members broadened their inquiry to examine systemic vulnerabilities in the defense acquisition process. Patterson's testimony emphasized constructive reforms rather than assigning blame, earning bipartisan appreciation for his measured, solutions-oriented approach. As the day drew to a close, Patterson, Jason, Sarah, and Colonel Harper gathered in the hotel lobby, their mission largely accomplished, yet each sensing the significance of what they had witnessed and participated in. "I've been invited to join the requirements team for the restructured program," Harper informed them. "They want combat experienced officers to help redefine what the next generation of armor should prioritize." That's excellent news, Patterson replied. They couldn't find anyone better qualified. Sarah checked her phone, scrolling through the torrent of coverage their story had generated. Atlas is already positioning for damage control. Their CEO has announced an internal review of ethics practices and the resignation of several senior executives who work closely with Blackwood. Sacrificial lambs, Jason observed, his youthful idealism tempered, but not extinguished by recent events. While the system that encourages such behavior remains largely unchanged, Patterson placed a hand on his grandson's shoulder. Change happens incrementally, Jason. Today we move the needle significantly toward greater integrity and accountability. Tomorrow we continue that work, each in our own way. Sarah looked up from her phone with a thoughtful expression. What about you, Bob? You've achieved what you set out to do. The corrupted decision has been reversed. What comes next? Patterson considered the question. Throughout his military career, he had always focused on the mission at hand, seldom allowing himself to look beyond its completion. Now, with this unexpected final chapter of his professional life concluding successfully, he found himself at another crossroads. I've been asked to serve on a blue ribbon commission examining the broader acquisition system, he revealed, not just for armored vehicles, but across all major defense programs. The goal is to identify structural reforms that would prevent this kind of situation from recurring. You should do it, Jason said immediately. Your perspective is exactly what they need. Patterson nodded slowly. I'm inclined to accept. One last mission, as it were. As their conversation continued, touching on lessons learned and future implications, Patterson found his thoughts returning to the German tanks that had started this journey. The Panther and Tiger stood as enduring reminders that military procurement decisions carried consequences far beyond balance sheets and technical specifications. They shaped battlefield outcomes, determined strategic options, and ultimately decided the fate of young men and women sent into harm's way. The parallel wasn't perfect, of course. America in 2025 wasn't Nazi Germany in 1943. Democratic institutions, civilian oversight, and systems of accountability created the potential for course correction when corruption or misguided priorities emerged. That potential, however, required citizens of courage to activate it, to stand for principle even at personal cost. Looking at his grandson, Patterson felt profound gratitude that the tradition of such courage continued into the next generation. Jason had risked his nascent career to stand for truth, displaying the moral clarity that defined genuine leadership far more than rank or position ever could. There's one loose end we haven't addressed, Sarah noted, interrupting Patterson's reflections. General Blackwood, have you spoken with him since his resignation? Patterson shook his head. No, I suspect that conversation will come eventually, but not yet. The wounds are still too fresh. He was your friend for 40 years, Jason said quietly. Despite everything, that history means something. Yes, it does, which makes his betrayal of our shared values all the more painful. Patterson's expression reflected the complex emotions surrounding the collapse of such a long-standing friendship. Perhaps someday we'll find a way forward, but that's a battle for another day. As evening approached, they made plans to gather for dinner, a small celebration of their unlikely victory against overwhelming odds. Before departing to change, Patterson took a moment alone with Jason, sensing his grandson had something more to say. What's on your mind, Lieutenant? He asked, using the formal address that acknowledged Jason's earned status rather than their family connection. I keep thinking about those German tanks in the museum, Jason replied thoughtfully. How decisions made 8 decades ago still resonate today. Still offer lessons if we're willing to learn them. Patterson nodded, encouraging him to continue. The Germans built the tanks they wanted, not the tanks they needed. They prioritized impressive specifications over practical effectiveness, and ultimately, that contributed to their defeat. Jason looked directly at his grandfather. We almost made the same mistake, didn't we? Yes, and like the Germans, we had officers who recognized the problem, but were initially overruled by political considerations and industrial influence. The difference is that our system allowed for correction, demanded it even once the facts became public. Patterson felt a surge of pride at his grandson's insight. That's exactly right. And maintaining that capacity for self-correction, that commitment to truth over convenience, is ultimately more important than any single procurement decision. As they walked together toward the hotel entrance, Patterson reflected that perhaps this was his most significant legacy, not the battles fought in distant deserts, not the medals earned or ranks achieved, but the transmission of values that transcended any particular conflict or era. The understanding that integrity wasn't an abstract virtue, but a practical necessity for any institution entrusted with the solemn responsibility of national defense. Outside, the setting sun cast long shadows across the landscape, not unlike those he had observed across the museum's tank displays days earlier. But where those shadows had evoked thoughts of past battles and hard choices, these suggested something different. The continuing journey of American democracy, imperfect yet resilient, capable of error, yet also of correction when citizens of courage demanded accountability. "Ready for dinner?" Jason asked, breaking the contemplative moment. Patterson smiled, turning away from the sunset to focus on the present. "Absolutely. I think we've earned it." Together, grandfather and grandson walked toward the waiting car, their mission accomplished but their shared commitment to the principles that had guided it undiminished. Behind them, the shadow of history. Before them, the continuing responsibility of ensuring that those who serve their nation do so with the best tools their country can provide, selected for the right reasons through processes of uncompromised integrity. The battle for the tanks was over. The larger struggle for accountability and purpose in public institutions continued. And in that continuing struggle, Patterson took comfort knowing that a new generation stood ready to carry forward the essential understanding that had guided his long career, that some principles were non-negotiable, some truths worth fighting for, some values transcendent across time and circumstance. Not merely because they were right in the abstract, but because they saved lives on the battlefield, because they honored the sacred trust between a nation and those who defend it, because they ensured that when young Americans went into harm's way, they did so with every possible advantage their country could provide. That was the legacy that mattered, the one worth fighting for, the one now secured for at least one more generation.